a black political party is where you gather people to come up with a report card. Here are the 10 things we want as we construct a we. Here are our agendas. And then you engage in two-party politics according to what your independent party has done. That's what the white boys did in creating what they call a white primary in places like Texas. And when you look at Nixon, the Nixon cases in Texas, when you look at all of those cases where black folk had to bust the white primary, it's because the Democratic Party was the electoral apparatus, but within the Democratic Party was the white supremacists who tried to privatize their action. And what the Supreme Court said is, you can't create a situation where the Democratic Party becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of your private political associations, because what you've done in effect is now endorse what you do privately through state action. See, that's the membrane through which white nationalism has been able to extend itself and to preserve itself. As long as they can put something into the field of private action, you see, they can keep it as private action. They have made the case, and the courts have allowed them to do this. Federal courts, they can make the case they can do whatever the hell they want. Freedom of association. That's why after Brown versus Board of Education, you see the creation of all these black private schools. In fact, there's a little book called Overturning Brown. I wish I had it at hand. I would show it to you all, where you see all these academies in the South, all these private schools in the South. They come after 1954, because if it's a private school, you do what you want. And then, of course, there was the challenge from the federal government of now having to force some of these schools, at least the colleges, like Bob Jones University and others. You can't discriminate if you're getting federal financial aid, because that money comes from the federal government, comes from the people. Therefore, we now have a say in these discriminatory practices you have on campus. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, and as it relates to Gary Chambers and what's going on in Louisiana and how we're thinking about this in terms of two-party politics, what we have to do, what we have done, what we have always done, is have political formations that are independent of the two parties that we then use to direct how we engage, using the two parties as avenues to exert pressure and to secure resources for ourselves. This is one of the pillars of the definition of black politics. How do black people secure resources for ourselves? So when you read the work of Mac Jones, when you read the work of Robert Smith, when you read the work of Jewel Presage or Shelby Lewis, when you read the work of the great Ron Walters, who Robert Smith in his book From the Bayou to the Bay, I wish I had it. Oh yeah, here it is. This is Robert Smith's new biography. In fact, I just interviewed him. Autobiography of a Black Liberation Scholar. I've talked about this before. Robert Smith says, Jesse Jackson is the most important black politician of the second half of the 20th century, and Ron Walters was the most important black scholar activist of the second half of the 20th century. And people could debate that. I think it'd be an interesting debate to have and discussion, but what you can't do is dismiss that insight from somebody who was there the whole time. And I don't know that I would disagree with him. In fact, I'd be inclined to agree with him, because I'd be hard pressed to name somebody who was more important and influential. Some people might say Adam Clayton Powell, but again, I don't know. I think Jesse Jackson and the formation that the Jackson campaigns of 84 and 88 represented, and equally important, the work that young Jesse was involved in as a junior lieutenant in that move from the 1960s forward that resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 65, among other things. Arguably, no Jesse Jackson, not as an individual, but as a figure in the formation that emerged out of the 50s and 60s. No Jesse Jackson, no Barack Obama, president of the United States. It's fairly clear. So when I hear, particularly, I'm not going to put this on young people. I'm going to put it on everybody. When I hear people say, well, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, they start roasting. I'm like, so clearly you don't know the history. And we're not talking about identity. We're not talking about personalities. We're not talking about what, all of us are human, which means we all got the possibility to get taken out with some personal revelation. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, looking at the larger political context, it's hard to make that argument. But anyway, black politics, as Smith and others have defined it, Smith, Jones, Walters, Presage, Lewis, all that crew and their students, is really about how do you organize black people to secure resources for black communities. It's just that simple in terms of that grounding pillar. And in Ron Walters' case, who traveled the world, his book, 1994-5, Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora, Walters understands black politics not just as a U.S. phenomena, but as a global phenomenon. So he looks at Latin America, he looks at Africa, he looks at black politics in Europe, and you start seeing this. So anyway, I set out to say that where we are today, when you see a Jamie Harrison, you see a Gary Chambers, what you're looking at is the failure of the black politics model. Mm-hmm. And you're looking at the failure that we could have predicted once Jim Crow, once U.S. legal apartheid was over, and the erosion of black institutions led to the need to either revive those institutions, create new ones, drawing from those ones, or surrender to just becoming appendages of the social structure formations. This is Cedric Johnson, one of Ron Walter's students, and among others, when he wrote a book a few years ago called From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders. And the cover of the book is a picture of them at Gary, Amir Baraka, Jesse Jackson, all them on the cover. And the whole point is, when you come out of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, coming forward, you had the NAACP, you had the Prince Hall Masons, the Order of Eastern Stars, you had all the fraternities and sororities in terms of the black kind of upper class. But in terms of the Masons and the Order of Eastern Star and all that crew, those are really also black working class and black poor, particularly in the South. And then when you add to that the network of black people who are working in formations that are walled off by apartheid, the black teachers, the black doctors, the black lawyers, as few as they were, what you then have is a set of structures that can inform a black politics. So when you see someone like Diggs, Congressman Diggs, Charles Diggs out of Detroit, his family owned funeral homes. That's a whole black network. This is before finance capitalism and the neoliberal models that have invaded even death. You know, they come in. I mean, when you read Carla Holloway's book, Passed On, about the history of death, as we talk about, the funeral practices, that was a time when black people controlled all of that, from the churches to the funeral homes to the cemeteries. But now, of course, that has been invaded by white people. But, Diggs is in a position to run for and win elective office and become a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, to be the black congressman who goes to Emmett Till's trial in Mississippi in the 1950s, who has a staffer, Randall Robinson, who creates Trans Africa to deal with these Pan-African questions. He's in a position to get into office because the people in Detroit know him because they've been burying their families. It's an institutional foundation for a black politics. It's very different than now, because what Johnson chronicles, what Walters talked about before he made transition, what you see is by the time you get to the 1980s and 90s, increasingly there's a new generation of black politicians who don't have those institutional ties. And by the time you get to where we are now, you've got black politicians who have no institutional ties to black people. Yeah, they may have been born in black communities. Yes, they know black people. Yes, they love black people, but there are no strong, independent black political formations. And now I'm not saying that those ones that were during apartheid either don't exist now, they do, or that they were completely progressive and Pan-Africanist and black power. No, they weren't. But apartheid was so bad that the things we were attacking, we could all agree on. This is Cedric Robinson's argument in his little book, Black Movements in America, where he says, there are two divergent political traditions in the black United States. You've got the assimilationist tradition, which has always been here. Those first Negroes petitioning for rights in Virginia and other places who are working this stuff out, who are the foregrounding of that black elite, who are modeling their notion of black liberation on proximity to what the white standard is of citizenship. And that's not to dismiss it at all. It's to say that they are in conversation with that because they're closest to it. And then Robinson says, the vast majority of black people, this is the politics of the plantation, the fields. These Negroes have contempt for these oppressors. They see what it is. They understand oppression as the rejection of Africa in all its formations. They develop a politics that is communitarian, that is separatist in the sense that not hate white people, kill white people, but we're not with them. We don't want to be with them. We reject the culture. We reject the moral standards. We reject all of that. And so what you see is these two divergent political traditions always existed. But in moments when there was an agreement between a simple objective, sitting where you want on the bus, be able to apply for and get a job, be able to vote, they come together, and that's where you see progress.